The world was screaming wind and crumbling earth. Lena's fingers, raw and bleeding, clawed at the thick root jutting from the cliff face. It was the only thing anchoring her to life. Below her, the ocean churned, a furious, hungry beast of gray and white foam, crashing against the jagged rocks 100 feet down. The spray was cold on her face, mixing with the hot, silent tears she refused to let fall. Above her, against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, was his face. Mark, her fiancé. The man who had put a ring on her finger 3 months ago and a chasm at her feet 3 minutes ago. His expression was not one of rage or passion. It was worse. It was impatience. Like a man waiting for a late train. "Just let go, Lena," he said, his voice thin against the gale. "It'll be faster. They'll find you in the morning. A tragic accident. So sad." She said nothing. All her energy, all her will, was focused into the agonizing grip of her 10 fingers. The root was slick with damp soil. Her muscles screamed, a symphony of fire and failure. He sighed, a theatrical sound of frustration. He picked up a small rock, no bigger than his fist, and tossed it down. Not at her, but beside her. It disappeared into the roaring void, a final, dismissive punctuation mark. He was leaving. He was actually turning to walk away. To leave her hanging between the sky and the sea, a human pendulum counting down its final swings. He was going back to their car, to their life, and would erase her from it like a stray mark on a ledger. He didn't know that from a sprawling villa carved into the cliff a quarter-mile away, a man was watching the entire pathetic drama unfold through the powerful lens of a tripod-mounted telescope. He didn't know this man, Julian, had seen the car pull over, had seen the argument, had seen the shove. And he certainly didn't know that the man watching was the one person on earth you never, ever wanted to make your enemy. Mark was about to learn that some cliffs are not made of rock and earth, but of consequences. And he was already falling. All right, back to the story. It had started, as most betrayals do, with a beautiful lie. The drive along the coastal highway was supposed to be a celebration. Mark had secured a major deal at his investment firm, or so he'd said. He wanted to take her to a fancy restaurant in the next town over, one that overlooked the sea. He'd been insistent, his smile a little too wide, his grip on the steering wheel a little too tight. Lena, ever trusting, saw only excitement. She saw the man she loved, ambitious and driven, wanting to share his success with her. She wore the blue dress he liked, the one that matched her eyes. She had let her auburn hair down, and the wind from the open window whipped it around her face as she looked out at the spectacular, rugged coastline. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. The sea was a deep, tranquil sapphire. It was a perfect evening, a picture postcard of a life she believed was hers. But something was off. A discordant note in a familiar song. Mark wasn't talking about the deal. He was talking about money. Not the celebratory kind, but the anxious, grasping kind. "It's incredible how much everything costs, isn't it?" he'd said, his eyes fixed on the winding road. "The wedding, the house deposit, it's like you're just constantly bleeding money." Lena had reached over and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We're doing fine, Mark. We're building a future. It's supposed to take time." Her voice was soft, a quiet melody that usually soothed his frayed nerves. She worked as a research librarian at the university. Her world was one of quiet order, of history and fact. It was a world away from his, a chaotic landscape of market fluctuations and high-stakes gambles. He'd always said he loved that about her. He'd called her his anchor, his calm in the storm. He flinched at her touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but she perceived it. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her hand retreating. "Everything's perfect," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Sorry, just a lot on my mind. The pressure of this new position, you know? They expect results. Big results." He turned to her and gave her that smile again, the one that used to make her heart flutter. Now, for the first time, it looked like a mask. Something hastily put on. "That's why tonight is so important," he continued, his voice regaining its practiced charm. "To forget all that. Just you, me, and the ocean." She leaned back in her seat, the seed of unease planted. She tried to crush it, to tell herself it was just his stress. She was good at that. She had spent the last 2 years of their relationship being the calm one, the steady one. She had managed his moods, absorbed his anxieties, and translated his frantic energy into something manageable. She had mistaken his dependence for love. He pulled the car over onto a scenic turnout, a gravel patch carved out of the cliffside. A low stone wall, barely knee-high, was the only thing separating the viewpoint from the sheer drop. "Let's just take a look," he said, killing the engine. "The sunset is amazing from here." The air was cooler now, laced with the sharp, salty tang of the sea. The wind was picking up, a mournful sigh that swept up the cliff face. It pulled at her dress, at her hair. It felt like a warning. Lena stayed by the car. "Mark, we'll be late for our reservation." "We have time," he said, walking toward the low wall. He stood there, his back to her, looking out at the vast expanse of water. His shoulders were rigid. He looked like a man on a precipice, in more ways than one. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't a celebration. This was something else. He turned to face her. The charming mask was gone. In its place was a chilling emptiness. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, looked like polished stones. "You know," he began, his voice strangely conversational, "I took out a life insurance policy on you a few months ago. A big one." Lena's blood ran cold. The wind seemed to stop. The roaring of the waves below faded to a dull hum. "What are you talking about?" "It's standard practice when you're getting married," he said, taking a step toward her. "For the mortgage, to protect our future. You signed the papers." She remembered. A thick stack of documents, mortgage applications, bank forms. He had rushed her through them, his finger pointing where to sign, his pen hovering impatiently. "Just formalities, babe," he'd said. She had trusted him. She had signed. "It has an accidental death clause," he continued, his voice devoid of all emotion. "A very generous one. A fall from a scenic viewpoint. On a windy evening. Tragic. Absolutely tragic." The world tilted on its axis. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. The man she was going to marry, the man she had woken up next to this morning, was talking about her death as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. "Mark, stop it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're scaring me." "Am I?" He took another step. He was between her and the car door now. "You know what's scary, Lena? Being $500,000 in debt? Scary is when the people you owe money to aren't bankers. They're not polite. They don't send letters. They send messages. Painful ones." His face contorted, the emptiness replaced by a desperate, ugly fear. This was the real Mark. Not the confident trader. Not the charming fiancé. A terrified, cornered animal. "I lost everything," he spat, the words torn from him. "A bad investment. Wiped out. I used the company's money to try and fix it. Made it worse. They know. They're coming for me, Lena. But with this money, with the insurance, I can pay them back. I can disappear. I can start over. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't make a sound. She was paralyzed by the sheer monstrosity of it. He wasn't just breaking up with her. He was liquidating an asset. Why? She finally managed to ask, the word a raw shard in her throat. Why me? He laughed. A short, bitter, horrifying sound. Because you're too good, Lena. You're too trusting. You're perfect. The perfect victim. No one would ever suspect. Poor, sweet Lena. Always saw the best in people. That's what they'll say at your funeral. He lunged. It wasn't a violent, powerful movement. It was clumsy. Awkward. The shove of a desperate coward. But it was enough. Her heels, chosen for a fancy dinner, not a fight for her life, slipped on the loose gravel. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing. Her back hit the low stone wall, and for a heart-stopping second, she teetered there. Then, she was falling. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. As she went over the edge, her hands shot out, searching for anything, for everything. Her fingers scraped against stone, then dirt. Then, miraculously, they closed around something solid, a root, thick and gnarled, protruding from the earth like a skeletal hand. The jolt as her full weight caught was excruciating. It felt as if her arms were being torn from their sockets. But she held on. She was alive. She was hanging. She looked up, and she saw his face, looking down at her with that awful, impatient stare. He watched her for a long moment, as if confirming his calculations. He saw her grip, saw the strain in her face. He must have known she couldn't hold on for long. That's when he spoke the words that would be seared into her memory forever. Just let go, Lena, it'll be faster. He turned and walked away. The sound of the car door opening, then closing. The engine turning over. The crunch of tires on gravel as he pulled away. And then, silence. A profound, absolute silence, broken only by the wind and the waves. He had left her to die. From his balcony, Julian lowered the telescope. His face was a mask of cold fury, the kind of fury he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 10 years. It was a familiar poison, one he had spent a decade trying to purge from his system. But here it was, coursing through his veins like a resurrected ghost. He was a man who had built an empire on reading people, on understanding the subtle currents of violence and desperation. He had seen it all. But the casual, bloodless cruelty he had just witnessed, it stirred something ancient and terrible within him. He had retired from his former life. He had left the city, the violence, the power. He had come to this isolated stretch of coast to find peace, to live out his days in quiet solitude, haunted by the wife and daughter he had failed to protect. He had built this house as a fortress against his own past, a beautiful prison of his own making. He had a code, a strict personal code forged in the fires of a brutal world. You do not harm women, you do not harm children, and you do not betray those who trust you. It was a simple code, but it was absolute. The man in the car had just broken all 3 of his rules in the span of 5 minutes. Julian moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that belied the storm raging inside him. He picked up his phone. It was a simple satellite phone, not a smartphone. It had only a handful of numbers stored in it. He pressed a single button. It was answered on the first ring. "Silas," Julian said, his voice a low, calm rumble. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Boss," came the reply. Crisp, professional, no questions. "Cliffside turnout. Mile marker 74. A woman is over the side. She's holding on. I need a full tactical rescue. Ropes, harness, medical. I want you here in 5 minutes. 3 minutes, Silas replied. The line went dead. Julian spoke again into the phone. Roman? A different voice answered, equally prompt. Yes, Julian. A dark gray sedan just left the turnout at mile marker 74, heading north. License plate is... He rattled off the number he had already memorized through the telescope. I want a tail on it. I want to know where it goes, where it stops, who the driver speaks to. I want to know what he had for breakfast this morning. I want to know the name of his first pet. I want his entire life on my desk by sunrise. Do not engage. Do not be seen. Just watch. Consider it done, Roman said. Julian hung up. He walked back to the telescope and looked through the lens again. The woman was still there, still clinging to that root. Her hair, a splash of auburn against the gray rock, was whipping wildly in the wind. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the desperate struggle. But she wasn't giving up. There was a strength in her, a stubborn refusal to die. He thought of his wife, Isabella. She'd had that same quiet strength, the strength of a willow that bends in the storm but does not break. It was the quality that had drawn him to her, a man of oak and iron. The memory was a sharp pain, a familiar ache in his chest. He pushed it down. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford right now. Later, there would be time for ghosts. Now, there was a life to be saved. And then, a reckoning to be delivered. Down on the cliff face, Lena's world had shrunk to the size of her hands. Pain was a constant, a dull, throbbing agony in her shoulders and forearms. Her fingers were numb, clumsy claws that she no longer trusted. The wind was a physical force, trying to peel her from the rock. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the terrifying void below. She tried to think, to plan. But her mind was a maelstrom of shock and betrayal. Mark's face kept appearing behind her eyelids, his empty eyes, his impatient sigh. He had tried to kill her for money. The thought was so grotesque, so alien, that her mind couldn't fully process it. It was like trying to imagine a new color. This wasn't the man she had loved. Or maybe it was. Maybe the man she loved had never existed at all. Maybe he was a fiction she had co-authored, a story she had told herself because she was lonely. A piece of dirt crumbled from under her left hand. She felt the root shift, a sickening lurch that sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She cried out, a small, involuntary sound that was swallowed by the wind. This was it. She was going to die. She thought of her mother, who had passed away 2 years ago. She thought of the library, of the smell of old books and polished wood. A quiet life, a good life, a life Mark had deemed expendable. A surge of anger, hot and clean, cut through the fear. No, she would not die for his spreadsheets and his bad debts. She would not become a tragic footnote in the story of his pathetic escape. She would not let him win. She opened her eyes. She adjusted her grip, a millimeter at a time, trying to find a better hold. She wedged the toe of her shoe into a tiny crevice in the rock, taking a fraction of the weight off her arms. She would not let go. Suddenly, a light. Bright and blinding, it shone down from above. She flinched, turning her head away. She heard voices, not Mark's voice. These were calm, professional. Ma'am, can you hear me? We're here to help you. Do not move. 2 men, dressed in black, were rappelling down the cliff face with astonishing speed and silence. They moved like spiders, their movements efficient and precise. One of them reached her side, his boots finding an invisible foothold. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm going to put a harness on you. It will only take a moment. Just keep holding on." Lena could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She felt him working around her, his movements swift and sure. A harness was clipped around her waist and chest. A rope was attached. "Okay," Silas said. "We have you. You can let go now. We have you." But her fingers wouldn't obey. They were locked in a death grip, fused to the root that had saved her life. It was as if her body refused to believe the rescue was real. "It's okay," the man said, his voice softening. He placed a large, warm hand over hers. "You're safe. I promise." Slowly, painfully, she uncurled one finger, then another. Then her hand fell away from the root, and she was supported entirely by the rope. The relief was so profound, so absolute, that a sob escaped her lips. She was being lifted, up, up, away from the roaring sea. She closed her eyes, limp as a doll, and let them pull her back into the world of the living. When she was safely on the solid ground of the turnout, they wrapped her in a thick, warm blanket. She was shaking uncontrollably, a deep, violent tremor that came from the very core of her being. A car was waiting, a black SUV with tinted windows, its engine purring. It hadn't been there before. Silas gently guided her toward it. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her teeth chattering. "To a safe place," he said. "Someone is waiting for you." As she slid into the plush leather of the back seat, she looked at the spot where Mark had stood. The gravel was disturbed where his car had been. It was the only evidence that he had ever been there at all. The only evidence of the moment her life had been shattered. The SUV pulled away smoothly, heading not back toward town, but further down the coast, toward a set of imposing iron gates she had never noticed before. The gates swung open without a sound, and they drove up a long, winding driveway toward a magnificent house that seemed to be carved from the cliff itself. It was all clean lines and vast panes of glass, a monument of modern architecture that looked both beautiful and menacing against the darkening sky. Silas led her inside. The interior was minimalist and vast. Polished concrete floors, walls of glass that offered a panoramic view of the churning ocean below. It was the home of someone with immense wealth and a taste for solitude. In the center of the main room, standing before a fireplace where a low fire crackled, was a man. He was tall and imposing, dressed in simple black trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. His hair was dark, shot through with distinguished silver at the temples. His face was rugged, handsome in a severe way, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of a life lived with intensity. Those eyes, a startlingly pale gray, watched her with an unnerving stillness. He was the man from the balcony. He stepped forward. "My name is Julian," he said, his voice the same low, calm rumble she'd heard on the phone, though she didn't know it. "You're safe here." He held out a hand. Not to shake hers, but offering a glass of water. His movements were deliberate, economical, powerful. Lena took the glass, her hands still trembling. She looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a very long time. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. A deep, quiet understanding of the darkness she had just faced. It was as if he was looking not at the shivering, terrified woman in front of him, but at the survivor beneath. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a large, comfortable sofa near the fire. "There is a doctor on the way to check on you. My housekeeper, Maria, will bring you some dry clothes." He was not asking. He was stating facts. He was creating order out of the chaos that had consumed her. Lena found herself obeying without question. The sheer force of his calm was a balm to her shattered nerves. She sat, pulling the blanket tighter around her. The warmth from the fire began to seep into her bones, chasing away the deep chill of the sea and the even deeper chill of betrayal. She looked at Julian, who now stood by the vast window, staring out at the ocean. He was a silhouette against the last vestiges of twilight, a guardian, a mystery. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slightly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I'm the man who is going to make sure he pays for what he did to you," he said. And in the chilling, absolute certainty of his tone, Lena believed him. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Julian was. Not who he was now, the quiet, enigmatic recluse in a glass house by the sea, but who he used to be. Julian was not his birth name. He was born Giorgio Costello, the only son of the head of the Costello crime family, one of the most powerful and feared syndicates in the country. He had not inherited his father's empire. He had conquered it. His father had been old school, ruling through fear and brute force. Julian, when he took over, had been different. He was smarter, more disciplined, more ruthless. He ruled through loyalty. His men did not fear him. They revered him. Because Julian had a code, he protected his own. He was brutal to his enemies, but fiercely, almost paternally, protective of his soldiers and their families. He did not deal in the kind of filth that preyed on the innocent. His business was a closed loop of power, money, and violence among men who had chosen that life. And then he met Isabella. She was a florist, a woman who created beauty with her hands. She was everything his world was not. Gentle, kind, full of light. He fell for her with the same shocking totality with which he did everything else. For her, he began to build a wall between his two lives, the life of Giorgio Costello, the crime boss, and the life of Julian, the husband and, eventually, the father. They had a daughter, Sophia. She had his gray eyes and her mother's smile. For 5 years, Julian lived in a state of precarious, impossible happiness. He believed he could keep the darkness at bay. He believed he was powerful enough to protect his light. He was wrong. It was a rival family, the Falcones, a new generation, greedy and reckless. They saw Julian's happiness as a weakness. They saw his family as leverage. There was an ambush, a car bomb. Not for him, for them. He had been in a meeting, delayed by 30 minutes. 30 minutes that cost him everything. He arrived at the scene to find a scene of unimaginable horror. His light had been extinguished. What followed was not a war. It was a cleansing. Giorgio Costello reemerged. But he was a different man. Colder. Emptier. He moved with the unholy focus of a wraith. He didn't just defeat the Falcone family. He erased them from existence. He dismantled their operations, seized their assets, and hunted down every last person involved. It was a campaign of such methodical, terrifying efficiency that it is still spoken of in hushed tones in the underworld. When it was over, when his revenge was complete, he found himself standing in the ashes of his life. There was nothing left. The victory was hollow. The power was meaningless. So he did the one thing no one expected. He vanished. Giorgio Costello died. In his place, Julian was born. He took a fraction of his immense, now legitimate fortune and disappeared. He found this remote stretch of coastline and built his fortress of solitude. He brought with him only 2 men, Silas, his most loyal enforcer, and Roman, his genius strategist. They were not his employees. They were the last remnants of his family. He had made a pact with himself. He would live a quiet life, a peaceful life. He would never again touch the violence of his past. He would spend his days watching the sea, the one thing as vast and empty as the space in his own heart. But the pact had a silent addendum, an unspoken clause. He had left the world of men and their petty wars. But if he ever saw true evil, the kind of cowardly, predatory evil that had taken his family from him, he would not, could not, stand by and do nothing. In Mark's pathetic, cruel act, Julian saw an echo of the Falcones, the same weakness masquerading as strength, the same willingness to sacrifice the innocent for personal gain. Watching Lena cling to that cliff, he had not just seen a stranger in peril. He had seen Isabella. He had seen Sophia. He had seen a chance, not for redemption. He knew he was long past that, but for justice, the kind of clean, absolute justice he had once been famous for. The pact was not broken. It was being fulfilled. Lena slept for 12 hours in a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. It was a serene, silent space, all soft grays and creams. When she woke, the storm of the previous night had passed. The sun was brilliant on a calm, turquoise sea. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. Then she saw her own hands, the cuts, the bruises, the broken nails. The reality came crashing back in. She found Julian in a library that rivaled the one she worked in. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books on history, philosophy, and art. He was reading, a cup of coffee at his elbow. "Good morning," he said, closing his book. "How are you feeling?" She didn't know what to say. "Better. Thank you. For everything." "Maria has made breakfast," he said, standing, "and Roman has a report for us." They ate in a sun-drenched dining room. The food was simple and delicious. Lena found she was ravenously hungry. It was as if her body, having survived, was now demanding to live. As they finished, a man entered. He was younger than Julian, with sharp features and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. This was Roman. He placed a thin tablet on the table in front of Julian. "Mark Peterson," Roman began, his voice crisp and businesslike. 34 years old, senior analyst at Sterling Wakefield Investments, lives in a downtown condo he can't afford. Drives a leased car he's behind on payments for. Engaged to Lena here. He gave Lena a brief, sympathetic glance. He has over $600,000 in undeclared debt. Half of it is to various high-interest lenders. The other half is to the Flynn brothers. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly at the name. Liam and Connor Flynn. They're still in business? They've moved into loan sharking for white-collar gamblers, Roman confirmed. They're vicious but amateurish. Mark owes them $320,000. The final payment was due yesterday. They gave him a 24-hour extension. Julian looked at Lena. He wasn't just trying to start over. He was trying to save his own skin. They would have killed him. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Roman continued. He went from the cliff to a bar downtown, had 2 whiskeys. Then he went to his office. Stayed for an hour, likely deleting files. Then he went home. At 11:43 p.m., he made 2 calls. The first was to the police, to report Lena missing. He put on a masterful performance, crying, panicked. He suggested she might have been distraught, maybe slipped while taking a photo of the sunset. Lena felt sick, the cold, calculated nature of it all. The second call, Roman said, a flicker of distaste on his face, was to the insurance company, to give them a heads up that a claim would be forthcoming. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the tablet. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with his controlled fury. "He's playing the part of the grieving fiancé," Julian said, more to himself than to them. "He believes he is in control. He believes he is clever." This was power. This was control. "What happens now?" Lena asked, her voice small. Julian finally looked up from the tablet and his pale gray eyes met hers. They were calm, but there was a fire deep within them. A promise of righteous retribution. "Now," he said slowly, "we build him a stage, and we let him perform his final act." The next few days were surreal for Lena. She lived in a state of suspended reality in Julian's magnificent, isolated home. She walked on the private beach, read in his incredible library, and had quiet meals with him. He never pressed her to talk about what happened. He simply created a space for her to heal, a sanctuary of calm and safety. But beneath the surface of this tranquility, a complex operation was in motion. Roman and Silas were ghosts in the background, their presence felt but rarely seen. Phones murmured in other rooms. Cars came and went in the dead of night. Julian was dismantling Mark's life with the precision of a surgeon. First, the Flynn brothers. Julian made a single, untraceable call. He didn't threaten. He simply informed the Flynns' much larger, much more dangerous underworld competitor that the brothers were operating on their turf. 2 days later, Liam and Connor Flynn disappeared. Mark's most pressing debt was erased, but not in a way that helped him. He was now a loose end in a much bigger, more violent game. The fear would eat at him. Next, the insurance policy. Roman, a master of digital warfare, hacked into the insurance company's network. He didn't cancel the policy. That would be too simple. He altered the primary beneficiary. Mark's name was replaced with the name of a charitable foundation for victims of domestic abuse. A foundation that, coincidentally, Julian had established years ago in his wife's name. The change was buried under layers of digital camouflage. It would be discovered, but only after the payout was processed. The company would then come after Mark for fraud. A long, expensive, and public legal battle awaited him. Then came the job. Roman compiled a detailed dossier of Mark's financial crimes at Sterling Wakefield, his embezzlement, his insider trading. It was all there, documented and undeniable. But he didn't send it to the board of directors. Not yet. That was the ace in the hole. Meanwhile, Mark was living out his lie. He gave tearful interviews to the local news. He organized a search party with Lena's friends, his face a mask of anguish. A Friends of Lena fund was started, and he made sure to be photographed making the first generous donation, with money he didn't have. He was building his narrative, brick by pathetic brick. He felt the first cold finger of doubt when the police search was officially called off after a week. They had found scraps of her dress on the rocks below, planted there by Silas. The official cause of death was listed as death by misadventure. The case was closed. Mark celebrated that night, alone in his condo with an expensive bottle of scotch. He thought he had won. He thought he was free. He didn't know that every word he spoke was being recorded. Every keystroke he made was being logged. He was a fly caught in a web he couldn't see, and the spider was just watching, waiting for the perfect moment. The moment came 2 weeks after the fall. "He's planning a memorial service," Julian told Lena one evening. They were on the balcony, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. A memorial? Lena felt a fresh wave of disgust. "Of course," Julian said, his voice laced with contempt. "It's the final scene of his play, the grieving fiancé, surrounded by friends and family, saying his brave goodbyes. It solidifies his victimhood. It's the perfect cover. He turned to her. He has booked the university chapel for this Saturday. I can't, Lena began. The thought of him eulogizing her, was too grotesque. You don't have to do anything, Julian said, his voice firm but gentle. But I think you should be there. Not for him. For you. To take back the story he stole from you. She looked at him, at his strong, calm face illuminated by the moonlight. In the past 2 weeks, she had seen glimpses of the man beneath the controlled exterior. She had seen the profound sadness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She had heard the gentleness in his voice when he spoke of his late wife. She was beginning to understand that his power came not from his capacity for violence, but from his profound capacity for loyalty and protection. He was giving her a choice. He was not telling her what to do. He was empowering her. Okay, she said, a new resolve hardening in her voice. I'll be there. Good, Julian nodded, because we will be there with you. The university chapel was beautiful. Stained glass windows cast jewels of light onto the polished wooden pews. It was filled with Lena's friends, her colleagues from the library, and a few of Mark's co-workers who were there to show support. They were a somber, black-clad chorus. A large, smiling photograph of Lena was placed on an easel at the front, surrounded by white lilies. Mark stood at the lectern, dabbing at his dry eyes with a handkerchief. He was delivering the eulogy. His voice was thick with false emotion, catching and breaking at all the right moments. He spoke of her kindness, her quiet spirit, her love for books. He was painting a masterpiece of lies. She was my anchor, he said, his voice cracking. My calm in the storm. I don't know how I'll go on without her. At the back of the chapel, hidden in the shadows of the alcove by the entrance, Lena stood with Julian. She was dressed in a simple, dark gray dress. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was pale but composed. She watched the man who had tried to murder her perform for a captive audience. The rage she felt was cold and clean. The fear was gone. Julian stood beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He was watching Mark with the dispassionate intensity of a hawk watching its prey. He was letting him have his moment, letting him climb as high as he could, just to make the fall that much harder. Mark finished his speech to a chorus of sniffles and sympathetic murmurs. He stepped down from the lectern, the very picture of tragic loss. That was the cue. The main doors of the chapel swung open with a loud groan, flooding the nave with afternoon sunlight. Everyone turned. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the bright light. As she stepped forward into the chapel, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned into shocked exclamations. It was Lena. She walked down the central aisle, her steps slow, deliberate, and perfectly steady. She did not look at the stunned faces of her friends. Her eyes were locked on one person. Mark. His face went through a rapid, grotesque series of transformations. Shock, disbelief, confusion, and then raw, primal terror. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, waxy yellow. He looked like he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. He was seeing the ghost of his own failed crime. Lena stopped a few feet from him. The chapel was utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. It was a frozen tableau of disbelief. "You forgot to mention the insurance policy, Mark," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried through the cavernous space with the chilling resonance of a funeral bell. It was not the soft, gentle voice they all knew. This voice was forged from betrayal and survival. It was made of steel. Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just stared, his jaw slack, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him in real time. From the back of the church, Julian stepped out of the shadows. He was not alone. Silas and Roman flanked him. They didn't look like mourners. They looked like what they were: enforcers. Julian walked calmly down the aisle, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. He stopped beside Lena. He did not look at Mark. He addressed the crowd. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his calm voice a stark contrast to the electric tension in the air. "This memorial service is over, but the accounting is just beginning." Mark finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled squeak. Who are you?" Julian turned his head and finally fixed his pale, cold gaze on him. "I'm the man who pulled her up," he said simply. "And I'm the man who is going to watch you fall." This was the trial, not in a courtroom of polished wood and black robes, but here, in this house of God, in front of everyone Mark had deceived. "What is this?" Mark stammered, looking around at the shocked faces of his audience. "She's alive. It's a miracle. Lena, baby, what happened? I thought you thought I was dead." Lena finished for him, her voice unwavering. "Because you left me to die. You pushed me off a cliff." A wave of gasps and horrified murmurs swept through the pews. The chorus was beginning to understand the true nature of the play they had been watching. "That's crazy!" Mark shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "She's hysterical. She must have hit her head. Someone call a doctor. Call the police." "The police are on their way," Julian said calmly. "But first, I believe there are some people here who would like a word." On cue, the chapel doors opened again. Two men entered. They were large, dressed in expensive but ill-fitting suits. They looked profoundly out of place. They were from Sterling Wakefield, members of the board. Roman had sent them the dossier on Mark's embezzlement 5 minutes ago. One of them held up a phone, his face white with fury. "Peterson, we've just seen the audit. You're finished. You're ruined." Mark's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. He saw only stony faces, his friends, his colleagues. They were all looking at him with dawning horror and contempt. "And I believe this is also yours," Julian continued, holding up a single piece of paper. Roman had printed it. It was a confirmation of the beneficiary change on the life insurance policy. Mark stared at it, his mind finally catching up to the meticulous totality of his destruction. The money was gone. His job was gone. His reputation was a smoking crater. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes back to Lena. The mask of the grieving fiancé was gone, replaced by the terrified face of the cornered rat he truly was. "Lena, please," he whimpered. "It was a mistake. I was scared. I was in debt. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, tell them it's a misunderstanding." This was the moment, the pivot upon which her old life and her new one would turn. Julian stood back slightly, giving her the stage. This was her justice to deliver. Lena looked at the pathetic creature whimpering before her. She felt no pity. She felt no hatred. She felt nothing. He was an absence, a void. He had no power over her anymore. "There is no misunderstanding, Mark," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You told me my kindness was a weakness, that my trust made me the perfect victim. But you were wrong. My kindness is my strength. My ability to trust is what makes me human. You are the weak one. Your cruelty was your weakness, and your greed made you the perfect fool." She took the engagement ring from her finger. It felt cold and foreign, a meaningless piece of metal. She didn't throw it at him. She didn't drop it. She placed it gently on the lectern, next to the book of condolences he had set up. "This is over," she said. As if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers walked into the chapel. They moved with a grim purpose, their eyes already locked on Mark. "Mark Peterson?" one of them said, his voice booming in the silent room. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Lena Evans." As they cuffed him, as he started to sob his pathetic, self-pitying tears, a man stood up from the back pew. He was an old man, Professor Albright, Lena's former mentor from the university. He was the wise elder, the voice of the community. "That man," he said, his voice trembling with righteous anger, pointing a finger at Mark, "preyed on the goodness of one of our own. He used her light to cover his own darkness. But light cannot be extinguished. It can only be revealed." He then looked at Julian with a nod of profound respect. "And thank God for those who are willing to stand in the darkness to protect it." The spell was broken. The room erupted. Friends rushed to embrace Lena, their faces a mixture of relief and horror. The facade of Mark's life had been publicly, brutally, and justly torn down. Julian guided Lena out through a side door, away from the chaos. Silas and Roman were already waiting by the black SUV. As they drove away, leaving the wreckage of Mark's life behind them, Lena felt a profound sense of release. It wasn't triumph, it was peace, the quiet, solid peace of a story that has finally found its proper ending. A month later, the world was a different place. Mark Peterson's trial was a media sensation. The story of the cliffside fiancé was on every news channel. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The embezzlement, the insurance fraud, the attempted murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, a broken man who would spend the rest of his days in a concrete box, paying for a single monstrous act of betrayal. The diner, now a bustling hub of community life once more, was a place of healing. Lena, having taken a leave of absence from the library, found herself spending more time there, not as a waitress, but as a friend. She helped Helen with the books, chatted with the regulars, and slowly, piece by piece, wove herself back into the fabric of a life she chose, not one that had been chosen for her. The fear that had haunted the edges of her days was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence she had never known she possessed. The aftermath in the chapel had become a local legend. The story of the ghost who returned to her own funeral to condemn her killer. It was a story of justice, of a community that had almost been fooled by a monster in their midst. Professor Albright's words were often repeated, a testament to the town's renewed sense of solidarity. They looked out for each other now, their eyes a little more open, their bonds a little stronger. Lena and Julian sat on his balcony, the place where it had all begun. It was a warm evening, and the sea was calm, a sheet of hammered silver under the rising moon. In the weeks since the trial, they had fallen into a comfortable, quiet companionship. He spoke to her of Isabella and Sophia, not with grief, but with a gentle reverence. He told her stories of their lives, sharing the light they had brought into his. In turn, she spoke of her dreams, of the quiet life she had always wanted, a life of books and peace. She had discovered that the foundation in Isabella's name was not just a tax shelter. Julian poured millions into it, funding shelters, providing legal aid for victims, and creating educational programs. He was using the profits of his dark past to build a future full of light for others. He was a man engaged in a quiet, lifelong act of penance. "You know," Lena said, looking out at the water, For the longest time, I thought kindness was a liability. I thought being gentle and trusting was just an invitation for people like Mark to take advantage. Julian was silent for a moment, watching her. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, he said, his voice a low rumble. But it is the carbon, the softer element that gives it its strength. Without it, the iron is brittle. It shatters. He turned his gaze to the sea. Cruelty, like Mark's, is brittle. It's loud and it's sharp, but it breaks under pressure. Kindness, your kind of kindness, is resilience. It bends, it endures, and it outlasts everything. It is the truest form of strength. This was the moral of the story, the explicit statement of the theme they had both lived. He tried to erase me, Lena said softly, to turn me into a ghost, a sad story he could tell. But he failed. He failed because you refused to let go, Julian corrected her. Not just on that cliff, but in here. He tapped his chest gently. You held on to who you were. That is a victory no one can ever take from you. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the sound of the waves and the vastness of the night sky. Lena felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. She was not his anchor, not his calm in the storm. She was his equal, a survivor who understood the darkness, but chose the light. What will you do now? Julian asked. I'm going back to the library next week, she said with a small smile. And I'm going to help you with the foundation. There's a lot of work to do. She was no longer a victim. She was a protector, in her own right. Julian nodded, a rare, small smile touching his own lips. The ghosts in his eyes seemed, for the first time, to be at peace. He had not found redemption, but he had found purpose. In protecting her, he had begun to protect the part of himself he thought had died with his family. They sat there for a long time, two solitary figures who had found solace in each other's company, watching the tide come in. The past was a scar, but it was no longer an open wound. The future was an unwritten book, and for the first time, Lena felt ready to turn the page. She was the author of her own story now, and it was going to be a beautiful one.